Well, good morning, Rhythm Church. How we doing today? You guys sounded a lot livelier a moment ago when you were talking about sounds. And so let's try that again. How are we doing today? Excellent. Well, I am so glad you guys are here. My name is Corey. I have the privilege of serving as a lead pastor here, and I also have the privilege of serving as a judge at the chili cook-off, which is also important. So I'm just saying, right, if we don't get some more chili, I'm not going to get to try as many things, and, church discipline may have to happen. And so if you could make sure that you are on that. Well, now that Holy Week has passed, we are jumping back into our series on 1 John. We're going to pick up where we left off. We're going to pick up at 1 John chapter 3, verse 1. We're going to look at verses 1 through 10. But before we do that, because it's been a couple weeks, I think that we may need some help re-jogging our memories a little bit. A lot of TV shows have caught on to this, where a TV show will have a previously on section, just a short one, that reminds you, especially if shows are only dropping once a week. I think about The Mandalorian. That's a popular one, and they drop a new episode about once a week, and so they have to remind you what happened previously. They have to answer many questions, the main one being, where is Baby Yoda, and is he safe? And so they got to do that at the beginning of each episode, and so I want to back up just a little bit to chapter 2, verses 28 through 29, because that is going to swing us directly into chapter 3. So 1 John chapter 2, verses 28 and 29, it says, "So now, little children, remain in him," Jesus, "so that when he appears, we may have confidence and not be ashamed before him at his coming. If you know that he is righteous, you know this as well. Everyone who does what is right has been born of him." So the main exhortation or challenge that John left us with was to remain in the truth. To remain in the truth about Christ and about the teachings of Christ, so that when he comes back, we don't have to be ashamed at his coming and cower at it, but we can have confidence and stand before God with that confidence. And so his focus there is on Christ's return. Now, verse 29 might seem a little out of place. It seems kind of drastic that he switches right away into talking about righteous living. But again, what he's talking about here is Christ's return and our response. Christ's return and our response. And that's really important because that is going to help serve as sort of signposts as we go into chapter 3, because you're going to notice that he is going to focus on the same things again. So that was your short previously on. Hopefully you can remember everything prior to that, but if not, no worries. We're going to dive into chapter 3. So let's read verses 1 through 6 first, then we'll talk about that, and then we'll finish verses 7 through 10. And you guys know the drill. If you see a word that is a different color, I want you guys to say that with me. John starts like this. He says, "See what great love the Father has given us, that we should be called God's children," and we are. The reason the world does not know us is that it didn't know him. Dear friends, we are God's children now, and what will be has not yet been revealed. We know that when he appears, we will be like him, because we will see him as he is. And everyone who has this hope in him purifies himself just as he is pure. Everyone who commits sin practices lawlessness, and sin is lawlessness. You know that Christ was revealed so that he might take away sins, and there is no sin in him. Everyone who remains in him does not sin. Everyone who sins has not seen him or known him. So John starts off here right away with the same focus that he ended with in chapter 2. And his focus for this passage is Christ's appearing, or Christ's return, his coming back to earth. And so that is the focus that he has here, and he is focusing on that because he has a particular goal in mind. Now, unlike chapter 2, his goal is not that we walk in truth or right beliefs. In this section, his goal is that we walk in purity, that we purify ourselves in light of Christ returning. Beyond this, he gives us two means by which we can do that. He says if we want to purify ourselves, then we have one thing that'll help us now, we have one thing that'll help us later. Now we can embrace God's love, and later we will see God's glory. And so we can embrace love now, we can hope for glory later, and God will use those things to change us and to make us pure as he is pure. So let's break that down a little bit. Let's start with embracing God's love. That's the first means that John gives us for purifying ourselves. He's saying if we could understand our identity as dearly loved children of God, we would walk differently. If we understand who we are and whose we are, our lives would look different. In fact, I think that that is one of the core things when it comes to our ability to change, is understanding the love of God. That's what he says right at the beginning. He says, see what great love the Father has given us, that we should be called God's children, and we are. So he's saying our being God's children is an act of sheer grace and love for us. He didn't adopt us into his family because he had to. He brought us into his family because he wanted to. And if we really understood that, it would change us. Think about it. If we understood how satisfying God's love is, then maybe we wouldn't have to chase it in sin, in substances, in porn, in notoriety, in wealth. Because if God's already satisfying to us, then we're not trying to go look elsewhere for something to fill what only God can fill. If we understood how accepted we are in God's love, then we wouldn't be so filled with insecurity and pride and fear of not measuring up. If we understood how secure we are in the love of God, how good his love is, then maybe we wouldn't be so panicked and afraid about what's coming in the future, because we could trust the God who loves us. If we understood how undeserved God's love is, it seems odd, but if we could understand how undeserved it is, it'll destroy any feelings we have that God might take it away from us, because we didn't earn it to begin with. So if we understand love, the true soul-satisfying love of God, and our identity as children loved by God, we won't be as tempted to find fulfillment in lesser loves. We won't be tempted to try to find fulfillment in impure things. See, it's sort of an indirect change. There's one idea when it comes to sin, that we could look at sin and look at the ugliness of sin, and that change us, and talked a little bit about that on Good Friday. But here it's different. It's if we look at Christ's love long enough, it'll remind us and reveal to us how everything else is a counterfeit. Because when you have the real thing, it tends to overshadow the lesser things. I think that's what John's getting at in verse 6 when he says, everyone who remains in him does not sin. Everyone who sins has not seen him or known him. Now, let's be clear. John is not saying that we will never sin. We know he's not saying that because if you back up to, I believe it was the beginning of chapter 2, where he talked about how Christ is our atoning sacrifice, that if we confess our sins, he will forgive. So he's not saying you'll never sin again, but I think he's showing us this principle that if we have seen the glory of God, the goodness of God, if we have come to know him and his love, we may be less prone to try to find things that are lesser than that. Let me explain it like this. I remember one time I was in college, and I went to this fancy steakhouse. Now, I didn't grow up wealthy, and so we didn't go to fancy steakhouses. I thought Outback was as fancy as it got. And so I got a chance to go to this steakhouse, and I was pretty pumped about it because I'm like, hey, I don't get to eat a $25 steak very often, and I wasn't paying, so I was looking forward to it. But I went, and I was with some family friends and some people from the church, and the waitress came around, and she got all of our orders, and she asked the really, really important question about the steak I ordered. The most important question: how would you like that cooked? And me, being a young college student who didn't know any better, I uttered the blasphemous phrase, "Well done." I know, it makes me sick. It does. I've repented and we have moved forward in grace, but I still am shameful about that moment. I didn't know any better. I was eating it and I thought, hey, this is cool. This is how steak's supposed to taste. And one of our family friends, and he was also the executive pastor at the church that my dad worked at, he leaned over and he said, Corey, he said, taste this. This is how a steak is supposed to taste. And he cut off a little piece of his cooked medium steak. I tried it. It melted in my mouth, and I have never gone back again. Because after that, I understood, at least for me, anything above medium, not worth it. Because I have tasted true steak. I know how that is supposed to taste, and so I don't want to settle for something lesser anymore. And so, again, that's what John's saying. He's saying, hey, if you've tasted of Christ, his glory, his goodness, his love, then it's going to become more obvious when you try to find love in lesser things. It's going to become more obvious that these don't compare. Right? These are well done. Christ's love is perfect. It's exactly what we need. Now, with that said, that's only half the equation. So embracing God's love for us is part of it. It's part of what helps us purify ourselves. But the second part of it, the second thing that helps us purify ourselves is the hope of glory later. See, John says this at the end of verse 2, going into verse 3. He says, when Christ appears, we will be like him because we will see him as he is. And everyone who has this hope in him purifies himself just as he is pure. Now, something I found really interesting as I studied this week is the angle that John takes when he is looking at Christ's appearing or Christ's return. I would sort of expect John to come from the angle of, hey, Christ is coming back. We don't know when it's going to be, so let's get to purifying ourselves in light of that. Or, hey, Christ is coming back. You want to be ready? So let's make sure we are seeking purity. And there are texts like that. I think of Jesus' parable, when Jesus is talking about the bridesmaids and the bridegroom that is coming. And in this parable, we are all the bridesmaids. Jesus is the bridegroom. And so he tells this story about how there are these 10 bridesmaids, and they hear that the groom is coming, and so they all get ready, and they go to light their lamps with oil so they can welcome him. And it says that 5 of them didn't have enough oil. And so they try to borrow from the others, and they're like, hey, get your own. You should have been ready. And so they rush off, try to get more oil as quick as they can and get back. But by the time they get back, the wedding has started. The doors are locked, and they are not coming in. And so Jesus' point with that is be ready. Because if we want to wander off into sin, assuming we have all the time in the world, Jesus is saying, no. Be ready when I come back. Make sure that you are ready. And that's a good word, but that's not what John is saying. He's looking at it from a different angle. Instead of looking at it from sort of a fear of God or a reverence for God, he is looking at it from the angle of hope. He says, everyone who has this hope purifies himself. It's not reverence or awe that is being talked about here. It's hope. That's what this passage is rooted in. Well, hope in what? Hope in seeing God as He is. Seeing God come back in all of His glory, knowing that He is coming back to His bride, the church. That's the glory. That's the hope we have. As we are looking for the day when Christ comes back, we see Him in all of His glory and perfection, and we get to be with Him forever. See, it's kind of like this. Think about dating. Maybe you're currently dating. Maybe you were dating. Maybe you hope to be dating. Maybe you've been married for a long time and dating sounds funny to you. If you think back, even if you're married, you think back to those first couple dates with your now spouse or significant other. If you think back on that, usually before those first couple dates, you're real nervous, you're real excited, and you are ultra prepared. Now, I can't speak to the ladies here, but I can speak for the guys. On that day, you put on deodorant and cologne. You brush your teeth. Maybe you even floss. You may have not flossed a day in your life, but you're like, I got to be prepared. This is an important date. Last thing I want is bad breath. You make sure that your car is clean, right? You get all the Taco Bell bags out of it. If you're me, get those Caribou cups out of there. I mean, you want them to know, like, hey, I take care of my stuff, okay? You want to be ultra prepared. Not because you're afraid, not because you have to, but you're going to be ultra prepared because you are excited about who you are going to see that evening. So, as we look towards Christ's return, we prepare, we seek to have our character changed into His image, not because we have to, but because we're ready for that day when He returns. We are excited about it, and we are looking forward to it. That's what John is getting at here. And so we will fight temptations, we will endure trials, we will persevere through pain, we will go through all sorts of things, we will cling to truth even when it's not popular. All of those things we do because it will be worth it in light of Christ's glory. It'll be so worth it. Paul talks about in Romans 8, he says, the coming glory, the current suffering is nothing in light of the coming glory. And sometimes I read that and I'm like, really, Paul? Like, come on, man. Like, suffering's pretty hard sometimes. But for Paul, Jesus' return was such a big deal that it covered all of the current pain he went through. And Paul went through a lot of pain if you read his story. And so we have this glory that is up ahead that is coming, and so it is all worth it. So if you want to put these two ideas together, these two means together into a point, you could say, when we know how loved we are and how glorious Christ is, our only response is a joyful, hope-filled pursuit of purity. When we know God's love personally, when we long for His glory, the only response is to say, I'm going to purify myself in light of that. And it's not always easy. If it was easy, we'd all done it already. But we got to keep walking in the right direction, seeking further into God's love, further picturing this glory that is coming. So we purify ourselves in light of these truths about God. So John's focus is Christ's appearing, His goal is that we would walk in purity, and the means to achieve this are God's love and God's glory. Now, John is going to explain how our pursuit of purity, or lack thereof, ultimately proves who we belong to. John's going to go for the jugular here. Look at verses 7 through 10. Little children, let no one deceive you. The one who does what is right is righteous, just as Christ is righteous. The one who commits sin is of the who? Devil. Of the devil. Ouch. For the devil has sinned from the beginning. The Son of God was revealed for this purpose, to destroy the devil's works. Everyone who has been born of who? God does not sin because his seed remains in him. He is not able to sin. Again, don't get hung up on that. We just talked about that. Because he has been born of God. This is how God's children and the devil's children become what? Obvious. Become obvious. Whoever does not do what is right is not of God, especially the one who does not love his brother or sister. And that's going to lead us directly into the text for next week. But John gives us two choices. He says we either pursue purity or we seek sin. And depending on what we do, that shows people that we are either a part of one kingdom or another kingdom. God's kingdom or the devil's kingdom. Up, down. No in between. And that may seem kind of harsh. We may want to be like, John, well, chill, bro. I mean, yeah, I don't follow Jesus, but it doesn't mean I follow the devil. And John would say, well, yes and no. Yeah, sure, you may not be a Satanist. You may not follow that in religion and ritual. But think about it like this. If you are walking in opposition to God, then you are walking in alignment with the devil, because the devil walks in opposition to God. So for Satan, he doesn't care what flavor that looks like. He doesn't care whether you're a Satanist, atheist, Buddhist, whatever. He doesn't care as long as you are walking in opposition to Christ. As long as you are walking against Christ, then as far as he's concerned, he's achieving. He is taking ground. Now, it's probably why John wouldn't have been too popular to the people around him. But he's showing us the truth that there is no in-between. There's only two options. And so the reality is, when people look at our lives, they should know which kingdom we belong to. They should know who we belong to. That's what he says. He says, this is how God's children and the devil's children become obvious. Whoever does not do what is right is not of God. So he says it is obvious who we follow, who we worship based on what we do. Because we walk in the same patterns of Christ. This principle applies to biological children as well. I have a twin brother named Cody. Anyone else in here a twin, by the way? All right, sweet, Jim. Fun fact, just as an aside, my brother's name is Cody. My name is Corey. It was probably really cute when we were little, but it's very annoying now, right? So if you're like, hey, we're going to have kids or we're going to have twins or whatever that is, just like name them something different, okay? Because you're actually playing yourself, because in the end, you're going to start calling them by the wrong names and the dog's name and, everything like that. So that's an aside. But I have a twin brother named Cody, and people used to tell us growing up, they'd say, Cody looks like my dad, and I look like my mom. I would always tell my dad I got the better end of the bargain there. But here's the thing. Even though I looked more like my mom, we could never figure out where the afro came from. See, this is a picture of me when I was younger. And we couldn't figure out why on earth my hair grew like that. Now, you might be thinking, oh, well, maybe he's related to some famous people. But I am not related to Bob Ross or Farrah Fawcett, okay? She's from the same town that I grew up in, but we are not related it was always confusing because people would wonder who I belonged to, or at the very least, how the heck I got that when it did not match the traits of the people I belonged to. And again, I think it's similar. If we live in sin and people look at our lives, they won't get the impression that we belong to Jesus. They're going to go, well, where'd that come from? Because that was not in your family line. That's not something that was passed down from Christ. So are we sure that you belong to Him? See, we want to push against the grain of culture and pursue purity with our eyes fixed on hope, with our identity rooted in God's love. And even if people don't agree with us, at the very least, people can say, well, I know they belong to Jesus. I know what kingdom they belong to because I've interacted with them. I have heard the way they talk. I know the things that they do. I know how they treat their family. I know so on, so forth. And so it reflects who we follow. Now, I've said this before, but the response to a text like this is not to just say, hey, I'm going to try harder. I'm just going to try harder to be pure. I'm just going to be better. That doesn't work. Because again, we've probably all tried that before. So the response is not, let me try harder, let me do more. The response is to seek God. Because it's an inside-out change. If I seek God and I come to understand His love better, I will change. I will pursue purity more. If I seek God and I come to realize how glorious He is, I won't want to settle for lesser things. And so the response in this is to seek God and to ask Him for His grace. Often my prayers are, God, help me love you more. Because I know I don't love you as much as I should. Because if I did, I wouldn't sin. And so God, help me love you more. God, help me see how glorious you are, because I can't change that, but God can. That is a heart-level transformation. And so we go to God and we ask for His grace. We ask for His mercy to change us, to expand our hearts, to expand our minds, so that we both worship and walk in a way that is honoring to Christ. So Christ is coming again. The goal is that we purify ourselves in light of that. And the means by which we do that is embracing God's love, hoping for God's glory, seeking Him more so that we live that out more fully. Let's pray together. God, we thank you that we are so loved. God, even when we don't feel it, even when it feels like we don't deserve it, God, we just thank you that your face shines on us. God, that your divine smile is set on us because of what Jesus has done. God, I pray that you would help us understand that. God, help us understand your love at a deeper level. God, like the apostle says in Ephesians 3, God, help us understand the height, the depth, the width, the length of God's love, so that we will then overflow in change. God, as much as is possible now, show us your glory and your goodness in a way that changes us and makes everything else pale in comparison. God, I pray that we would be people that live loved and that live grounded in hope. And we thank you for what you've done, God. Expand our minds and hearts to receive it. In Jesus' precious name we pray. Amen.